This is Winston Churchill, speaking to you from number 10, Downing Street. Nothing lifts my spirits like a blast of Professor Buzzkill during our darkest hour. He busts myths and takes names like a squadron of Spitfires strafing enemy positions. And I'm totally stoked that he's here again to save Western civilization. So, relax with your favorite whiskey and become enlightened.
Indeedy, it is Professor Buzzkill here, busting myths, taking names, making tons of money doing so. Tons of money, of course, that we have to dole out in envelopes full of cash like Sonny Corleone to
And also because you're in the top tax bracket.
That's right, we're in the top tax bracket. To our guests like Professor Nash, who's here to talk about Versailles and the World War I settlement, because after all, it's 2019. We're looking now at what happened in 1919. How are you, Professor?
I'm doing great, thanks. 100 years. How time flies.
Are you feeling very settled? Get it?
Yes, I am, as a matter of fact.
Good.
Can I begin with a quotation?
Yes, that'd be a good idea.
So
and this is a real one, by the way.
Exactly. You don't need to fact check this. This is a real quotation from a real source. And I'm quoting, "No treaty in history has produced so much comment, has been so freely criticized, and possibly so little read and understood as the Treaty of Peace signed at Versailles."
Yeah, that's putting a lot on the Treaty of Versailles.
That is according to your Department of State in 1947, which is interesting.
Yes.
I haven't actually read the thing, but after World War II, they did an official study of the post-World War I peace, which I find kind of interesting that they would do that.
Are they trying to find out why World War II started?
Or also trying to figure out how to make peace and how not to do it that way.
Right. Because presumably the treaties after World War II are not very complicated.
Well, actually, there really aren't any. I mean, there is no equivalent. You know, they have the San Francisco Conference where they create the United Nations, but there is no equivalent.
Oh, because it's just complete surrender on both sides. Anyway,
correct. Yeah,
we're getting ahead of ourselves because we're talking about World War II, not
definitely.
World War I. So, but this all happens because of the situation. It's after the November 1918 armistice. So what is that situation?
Right. And we did a show on that, didn't we? We talked about the end game of World War I think.
I don't remember. It was so long ago. It may have been in 1918.
On very primitive recording devices.
Yeah, that's right.
Anyway, so the shooting stops in November 1918, but let's remember that when you officially declare war, you have to officially declare peace. So you have to have a peace treaty.
An armistice is not technically a peace. It's
an armistice is a ceasefire.
Ceasefire. Yeah,
It's
a
just
big ceasefire.
A huge ceasefire, and it might be permanent or semi-permanent, like we have in Korea. That's basically there's no peace treaty there.
That's
anyway, so the victorious Allies meet in Paris starting in January 1919. And by the way, they don't actually meet in Versailles. They typically meet in Paris.
But by the way, we should remind Buzzkillers, Versailles is 20 miles outside Paris?
Yeah, it's
the Palace of Versailles.
Correct.
Okay.
That's where they actually are going to sign it in June 1919.
Because it's more glorious and
right.
ornate.
Well, and also there's this unbelievably petty payback thing. The Hall of Mirrors at Versailles is where the German Empire was declared in 1871 over the defeated France. And so it's...
Lordy.
Once again, kids will be kids.
Yeah. Okay.
So they meet to hammer out a peace. Woodrow Wilson comes personally. This is I can't think of another case in American history where you had an American president overseas personally 4 months negotiating a treaty.
No, that's gone a long time.
Yeah.
Normally they just show up for the last 2 days.
Yeah, exactly. And by the way, there's some good reasons for that, as this case in some ways shows. He comes home briefly in March, I believe, and then immediately goes back. So he's basically out of the United States for 6 months.
Wow.
And that's partly because Wilson's going to Wilson. I don't think he didn't really trust anybody else.
Meaning Wilson is international negotiations and everything is Wilson's
also he's
wheelhouse.
Incredibly arrogant and incredibly full of himself. And right. Okay. And he also infamously doesn't bring any Republicans with him, which... Anyway,
so Wilson's got a Wilson. You got to stop with the technical terms. Come on,
I'm trying to make that into a verb. He's an important guy. So you have all this. It's still a complex and chaotic period. You have this sort of euphoria of victory on the Allied side. You have, and this is really important, one of the reasons why Versailles ends up the way it does and why it ends up so complicated is that even though you have the winning side getting together and trying to hammer out a peace, they are not at all on the same page. Right.
Okay, right.
I mean, for example, it's complicated by the fact that these are all, to one extent or another, democracies, so they have to have to keep their publics happy.
And let's remind the Buzzkills how many we're talking about: Britain, France, the United States, Belgium.
No, I mean
they're not counted.
By the way, there are 32 countries represented, but very quickly the day-to-day negotiations boil down to what are called the Big Four.
Okay,
which is the United States, Britain, France, and Italy.
Italy, yes, of course. Sorry,
and that also. I'm not going to talk about it, but the sort of medium and smaller countries immediately start resenting all this because they've been shut out.
Absolutely.
Now, by the way, you can also argue that's for some good reasons because try having a single table with 32 representatives and arrive at any agreement or make any progress. Good luck with that.
I was going to say it sounds like the Democratic primary debates.
They should have had a debate.
Those will be over before. Well, not over, but never.
No, in fact, they'll just be starting.
Yeah.
So you have, and because you have public opinion involved, and also these complex leaders themselves, you have these conflicting desires. On the one hand, you want some of the spoils of war,
right?
You want something for your victory. You want something in return for all the sacrifices you've made.
Sure.
On the other hand, you also want a lasting peace, right? You don't want to have to do this again in a few years. And then on top of all that, you have the sort of the idealism of Woodrow Wilson. Right. Of his so-called 14 points. In particular, Woodrow Wilson wants a new world.
Right.
I mean, that's not an exaggeration. He wants to create a new world in which you don't have wars.
Yeah.
And also, he wants to eliminate some of the causes of wars. And so one of his big goals is what's called self-determination. In other words, you allow subject peoples to determine their own destiny, asterisk. Within some very
within Wilsonian framework.
But also I'm basically self-determination for me, but not for thee.
Yeah,
in other words,
and
by that I mean particularly in Europe.
Yeah.
Right. You're gonna redo the map of Europe, but you're not, for example, going to give self-determination to Indians or Vietnamese or anybody else around in the victorious empires.
Well, even within Europe, the Irish nationalists don't think of themselves as getting self-determination.
Correct. Right. In fact, they're going to fight for it.
Right. Exactly.
At about the same time.
1920,
about the same time. So, and you have, even more than that, you have deep disagreements among the Allies. For example, how harshly do you treat Germany?
Mm-hmm.
And these disagreements are fundamental, and they are apparent right off the bat. If you're France, for example, you want payment for all the damages. Let's remember that the war in the Western Front was fought almost entirely on French soil.
Yes,
and northern France has been made to look like the surface of the moon. And by the way, the physical scars still have not entirely healed 100 years later.
No, and sadly, as a sad comment on human nature, I think you can take sort of tourist tours of the
they've preserved
the mortar holes.
Well, it's also craters, and also they've preserved some of the trench systems, etc.
Sure.
Right, sort of a disaster tourism. That's mean. I guess we could call it historical tourism. Same thing. But how harshly do you treat Germany? France wants Germany not destroyed, but so weakened that it never presents a military threat to France again. And let's remember, France and Germany share a border.
They share a long border and that they've fought over for centuries.
Yeah. So if you're France, understandably, you want certain guarantees. You want a punitive peace that pays for damages and keeps Germany down long term. Yep. If you're Britain, you're in a different situation. You've got this fabulous thing called the English Channel. You don't have France's security problem.
Yeah.
You basically want the German high seas fleet to go away.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're pretty much okay with everything else. You also, by the way, don't want, if you're in London, you don't want too weak a Germany because you want a Germany that can continue to sop up a lot of your exports. There's an economic angle to this.
Yes.
France wants a much more economically weak Germany than Britain does.
Yes. Anglo-German or especially Anglo-Prussian trade is a very big deal.
Oh, my God. You know more of this than I do. It's key to 19th century economic development in Europe, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely, yeah.
So you've got all these differing views. The British and French generally don't share Wilsonian idealism, to put it mildly.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Wilson wants a non-punitive peace. Even before the war was over, Wilson was talking about a peace without victory.
Right.
Which is the kind of slogan that makes French and British people laugh.
Yeah.
Because they've sacrificed so much more than the Americans have. And that's another difference, right? The British and French feel like the Americans are sort of Johnny-come-lately.
Yeah, because after all, they came in 1917, 1918,
right.
and
After
not 1914.
hundreds of thousands of British and Frenchmen had already died.
Yeah.
And so the British and French feel a little resentful that Wilson comes in. And by the way, Wilson also gets this rock star treatment when he arrives. Crowds just turn out for him.
Again, more the Wilson got a Wilson thing.
Yeah, and he partly because of his rhetoric, partly because he represents America, the sort of fresh new ideas. And, Clemenceau and David Lloyd George, they don't get the rock star treatment.
Again, the French premier and the British prime
That's
minister.
right. Correct. Thank you. And then he comes in their view at the last minute and starts to try and boss them around and talk about a new world when the United States, in their view, hasn't paid their dues.
Yeah,
that's whereas from Wilson's standpoint, it's like, we won the war because of us. We deserve a major seat at the table.
Yeah.
And you Europeans need to learn how not to keep fighting wars against each other.
And Wilson had been, not even before he was president, maybe even before he was governor, had been writing about the nature of peace and the nature of diplomacy.
Correct.
And publishing about these things for a couple of decades.
That's right. And
he really thought himself an expert.
That's right. Well, and also, and his sort of baby, if I can use that term, is the League of Nations, is an international organization to preserve the peace, and that's what he also brings to this. And we'll talk more about that later. But the Germans, in case you wonder why I haven't mentioned the Germans were not invited.
Now, this has always blown my mind, and I always want to ask a 20th century person like you about this, because it just seems to me how harshly to treat Germany is just going to make it more harsh and unreasonably harsh if you don't invite the Germans and ask them.
Right, that's true, although I share that sentiment. Although, on the other hand, I run the thought experiment. Let's say you invite the Germans. How do those negotiations go? It's not going to be a negotiation. The British and the Americans and the French are always going to say, look, you surrendered. We won.
Yeah, okay.
The treaty will have this in it, and you will like it, right? So it's going to end up being dictated in any case.
So the Germans may have had more resentment if they'd actually been there.
Right. Or it might have been just a futile exercise.
Okay.
That's what I would say. On the other hand, but you might say that that if the Germans make their case effectively, that maybe they have some of the harder edges taken off. Who knows? But we do know that they were not invited. They were invited at the last minute just to sign the thing
at Versailles.
So it's really not. I mean, the negotiation is all on the Allied side. And by the way, throughout this period, and this is going to be the main reason that the Germans sign, even though they obviously object to almost everything in the treaty, is that the Allied naval blockade of Germany throughout this period, early 1919, is still in force.
Yeah, which could lead to.
So this is hardball, like with a capital H. Because the Germans
food shipments, all sorts of stuff.
Millions of Germans are malnourished. Even though the shooting has stopped. So the Allies, and then by the way, later on when it does come to time to sign this, the Allies also say, by the way, if you don't sign this, we're going to invade. Which the German army was not in a position to stop at that point anyway. So the Allies are going full gangster when it comes to.
What else is going on? Because I mean, I know it's just not not 1918 on its own. Not everything is happening in Paris.
Right. Well, and that's what's also made. There's so many layers, and everything I just described is chaotic and complicated enough.
Yeah.
But this is 1919. This is just a year and a half after the successful Bolshevik Revolution in Russia.
Exactly.
In early 1919, as this conference is getting underway, the new German civilian government has to relocate to Weimar, and that's why it's called the Weimar Republic, because Berlin is basically in the middle of a civil war, where there's a communist uprising that's being crushed with utter brutality. You also have, early 1919, you have a communist revolution for 6 months in Hungary under Bela Kun.
Oh, that's right. Yes. I always forget about that.
You have a communist uprising in Munich. Bavaria is for a few months essentially a people's republic.
Yeah.
So there's this threat of if you're Wilson or Clemenceau or Lloyd George, you've got sort of one eye looking over your shoulder. Is the Bolshevik Revolution going to continue to spread into Europe and basically threaten everything we try to do here?
Right.
So you've got that. You've got a civil war in Russia. You've got Allied intervention in Russia, partly for some of these reasons. This is also in the midst of, let's not forget, the end of World War I has entailed the collapse of 4 empires.
4 empires. Oh, yes.
Quiz time. Can you name them?
Well, obviously the German Empire.
There's one.
Russian Empire.
There's 2. Just to Germany's south, the most amazing empire ever, to the
Austro-Hungarian.
There you go.
Yeah. I was not thinking about that because, of course, it was really collapsed and never came back.
Right. And then one more, barely in Europe.
Barely in
Sick
Europe.
man of Europe.
So, for the Ottoman Empire. Buzzkillers, please do not write in, email in and say what a moron I am.
What is up?
My field is 1832 to 1852.
So if you want to talk about the corn laws.
Yes, of course. Yeah, I'm your man.
No, by the way, if I can just put a plug in here, you can get it on DVD. In the mid-'70s, the BBC did a series called The Fall of Eagles.
Oh, yes.
About the fall of the Habsburg, Hohenzollern, and Romanov empires.
Yeah, all of whom have eagle icons in their family crests.
It's a pretty good show, and it's worth seeing, if only because you can see a young Patrick Stewart playing Lenin.
When Patrick Stewart had hair.
Actually.
No.
Well, I can remember Lenin was bald too, so he was perfect.
Yeah.
I mean, it's pretty amazing. Anyway, so I highly recommend the show. It's called Fall of Eagles, I think 1974.
Okay, so we're talking about there's just almost too much going on for this conference to succeed. The odds of failure are
absolutely
high.
Right. And critics of Versailles, and there are plenty of them, should keep that in mind. That the idea that this was going to work out perfectly, and that everyone was going to be happy with it, and it was not going to cause any future problems. Frankly, I think that's a little naive and a little unfair, because of how complicated the problem, the sort of overlapping problems are. It really makes this as a nightmare.
So how did the actual talks then go?
Well, we're not going to go into the details. We don't have time, but it was tough. It took months for a reason. There's lots of wrangling. As I said, the smaller powers were increasingly excluded, which only built their resentment. But once again, if you're reshaping the map of Europe, you can make an argument you should have a small group of people locked away in a room. Yeah, right. Just to hash it out. And that's sort of what the Big Four did. Yeah. And even that didn't work out very well, as we'll see. For example, Wilson wants to avoid a punitive peace, and even he flat out loses. He has to give in. Those are sort of the irreducible demands of the British and French.
The simple fact is he's outvoted.
That's right. But he also gets what he wants. He gets his League of Nations. Calls for self-determination for subject peoples. And there are people like, well, he wasn't known as Ho Chi Minh at the time, but the young Ho Chi Minh actually went to Versailles.
Yes, I always forget that too.
With other Vietnamese nationalists saying, oh, this self-determination stuff sounds great.
Yes.
How about some of that? Some of that for us? Yeah. And no, they are basically right because it is amazing. The British and French empires actually get bigger.
Yes, that's right.
As a result of Versailles,
people think of the collapse of British and French empires in this period, but it's actually after World War II, not World War I.
That's right. No, in fact, I think the famous pink map of the world where the sun never sets on the British Empire. I believe its peak is in the middle 1920s.
Yeah, that's certainly true.
So there are all sorts of compromises made. In June, the talks are concluded. The Germans arrive and are outraged by the terms, but are forced to sign. And like I said, there was this invasion threat hanging over them on top of the ongoing naval blockade. So they really have no choice. And that's why it's really lame, if I can use that term, for German nationalists back in Germany to say, how could you have signed this thing?
Yeah.
Well, it's not like these people were traitors. They were going to be portrayed as traitors.
You mean the Germans who signed it were not traitors?
They're outraged. They look at this thing and they spit up. They're like, are you kidding me with this? And it's like, no, here, you have to sign. Yeah. If you don't...
Or we're going to invade.
Yeah, we're going to invade and occupy. And by the way, there are some worse things than signing a treaty like this if you're Germans, and that is having your country occupied or broken up. Yeah. Right?
Yeah, they really had no choice.
So German nationalists are really a huge part of the problem here long term. So
longer into the 20s and 30s.
Absolutely, because it really is just this very strong and completely irrational force that just ignores sort of facts on the ground. So what are some of the major terms in this treaty that signed end of June 1919? Once again, it's hundreds of pages.
Yes, that's right.
In fact, I think it's like 1,000 pages all in.
Yeah,
and
it's just amazing,
I'm going to cop to not having read the whole thing.
Damn, and you call yourself an expert,
and I'm not
diplomatic
ashamed about
historian.
that.
Yeah.
And any buzzkillers want to sit down and read the entire Versailles Treaty, and then you get back to us.
Yeah.
It's got hundreds and hundreds of articles. It entails, among other things, loss of German territory. The Germans lose about 13% of their territory.
Yeah, and they don't just lose it. I mean, it's lost the whole sort of circle of Germany.
Right. Everywhere but in the south, they not surprisingly lose Alsace-Lorraine, back to France. And actually back to France. I mean, you had French and Germans living in those areas, but it belonged to France before 1871. The Germans took it, now there's no way the French were not going to take that back.
Yeah.
There are other territorial concessions. The biggest are in the east. where the Germans give up a lot of their eastern territory to create this new thing called, to revive this thing called Poland.
Yes, Poland is this amazing sort of.
Oh my God!
Here again, gone again.
Yeah, it's geographically the most unfortunate country in European
Yes,
history.
absolutely, absolutely.
I think that's the way to put it.
It's amazing the language survived as well as it did
yeah.
because, well, I mean, it's natural in a way, but
I was just amazed to find out a little factoid that today in 2019 there are still hundreds of thousands of Poles who live in what we call Belarus and Ukraine.
Yeah, that's
even
right.
today. After all this,
Yeah.
there's still entire Polish communities there, which
Yeah.
is amazing.
It's amazing.
Anyway, so Poland, and not only has Poland created Germany's expanse, but let's keep in mind that it literally cuts Germany into two in the so-called Polish corridor to
Yes,
give
that's right.
this revived Poland access to the Baltic Sea, the free city of Danzig. They create it as a free city, so everyone has access, and then all its hinterlands go to Poland.
Yeah.
And so now East Prussia in the east is severed from the rest of Germany, which is going to really ruin the day for a lot of German nationalists.
Oh, yeah.
To put it mildly.
Yeah.
So they lose 13% of their territory. There's very strict limits put on the German military. Their navy is drastically reduced, and most of the German high seas fleet, rather than turn themselves over to the British, famously scuttle themselves.
Right.
Scapa Flow, I believe.
Yeah. And by the way, this is one of the biggest British demands.
Yeah, absolutely. They want the German navy to be reduced, and they're not allowed to have submarines. By the way, those are banned.
Oh, yeah.
The German Air Force is banned.
Right.
Just completely, literally busted up for kindling. You can see pictures of this online because the airplanes were all made of wood, so they burned them.
Yeah.
The army is reduced to 100,000 men, which is just a little bit bigger than the Prussian police force after World War I. Just to put it in context, so it's a super tiny army, and this is all French demands. They want
like a national guard,
pretty
or a
much,
home guard,
pretty
rather
much.
Than,
This is France. France wants a Germany that is not a military threat. Germany loses all of its overseas colonies. More on that in a minute. Infamously in Article 231, they de facto are forced to accept sole guilt for having started the war.
Okay, now you say de facto, but I thought
the language is a little vague, actually.
So the war guilt clause, again, 1,000 pages. We haven't read the entire thing, or at least I haven't read the entire thing. After all, I struggled on the sick man of Europe, which I should have known.
You need to go back to your study group.
I need to go back to my
Finals coming up, dude.
Yeah. Alzheimer's and all. I always think of the war guilt clause. First of all, I always think of it as a clause, and I think of it as pretty direct.
Yeah, I mean, I'd have to look at the wording again. I just remember reading it and thinking, wow, that's not 100%. Germany hereby accepts sole guilt for the war. It's a little vaguer than that, but the important thing is how it's been interpreted.
Right, and it is played by Germans to be that way.
That's right.
In the 20s.
And it does. I mean, it certainly implies Germany's sole guilt, and that's the important thing, because while Germany is obviously a key factor in starting World War I,
it's not.
I don't think anyone would have said they were 100% responsible. For example, what the Austro-Hungarians and the Serbs and the Russians are doing at the same time also is very, very important.
Yeah, you might as well dig up the course of Gavril Princip and make him sign a war guilt clause. He's the guy who shot the Austrian Empire, Emperor and his wife, and sort of started the whole thing. Was this sort of trigger?
Right. Well, let's keep in mind also that the purpose of this war guilt clause is to then justify the next article, which is reparations. In other words, the fact that you can claim Germany started this war, therefore Germany should have to pay for damages.
Right.
Because France's economic problem is that a very economically important part of the country, i.e. northern France, has been laid waste.
Yeah.
Go look at the pictures of the Western Front in World War I, and you'll see that there aren't any trees left standing.
No,
and mines have been flooded, and entire bridges have been destroyed, entire towns have been flattened, and the dollar cost or the franc cost of repairing that is huge. And the French government and people would say, "Well, we're not going to pay for this.
No,
the Germans should have to pay." And so that justifies reparations.
How much? What did they put a price tag on this?
Not in the treaty. They basically say there's going to be a reparations commission, and it doesn't actually decide until 1921 what the dollar figure is. And the dollar figure is, the figure I've seen is $31.4 billion.
In 1919.
In 1919. Today, that's about $442 billion.
Crikey.
So it's a big price tag, no question. And once again, the idea on the French part is pay for damages, B, owe us money for years and years and years so that you're economically weak. And so
keep you in this repayment status, as we would say in modern banking terms.
Right. And so if the Germans say, well, we couldn't possibly pay this, the French would say, well, that's a feature, not a bug. In other words,
that's right.
In other words, that's the intent. Which we want your sons and daughters to be paying this too.
Yeah. Right.
And of course, the British are a little more wary about this because, like I said, they're not interested in wrecking the German economy. They want the German economy to revive.
Sure.
They look at this as a problem, which is why someone like Don Maynard Keynes, what is it? The Economic Consequences of Peace.
Famous British economist.
Right. Yeah. And I'll attack him in a minute.
But I mean, it's not just the British saying that the continued reparations and the severity of the reparations is going to cause resentment, which is going to really lead to the rise of extremism in Germany.
Right.
It's also the British saying we need the German economy to survive because they're one of our biggest customers.
Yeah. By the way, the victorious Allies are going to face this exact same problem at the end of World War II.
Oh,
Lots of people claiming for the what's the term? The pastoralization of Germany. In other words, turn it back into this agrarian country. And other people are like, not so fast.
Yeah,
you need to think this through.
Yeah,
because if you destroy one of the most powerful industrial economies on the planet, there's going to be a huge price to pay for that.
We're going to need someone to sell our ball bearings to.
For example, yeah, absolutely. And if they're all like Germans behind the plow, they're not going to be in a position to do that. So these are some real like sort of meaty economic debates going on here. And then finally, it also includes, so baked into the treaty is what's called the Covenant of the League of Nations. And notice, by the way, the
covenant,
not very subtle religious imagery here. And then once again, we can thank Woodrow Wilson for that. The Covenant of the League of Nations. So it is. In part of the treaty is the creation of an unprecedented international organization to keep the peace.
Yeah, remember, Buzzkill, this has never happened before. Certainly not on this scale. There might have been, under Charlemagne, there are agreements between his three kingdoms, but that's a relatively small
You had
thing.
alliances, you had treaties, but you didn't have something as ambitious as this, which is basically all the great powers in a permanent organization that basically polices the world and prevents major war from happening again.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to give Wilson and others credit for the concept. For the concept
and the sort of hope, the aspiration.
Right, because the bloodletting was unprecedentedly bad in World War I, and people it was the worst nightmare that this will happen again in a few years. And we would waste another generation of young men dying for very little reason.
Well, I'll tell you what, Buzzkills, we're going to take a station ID break because we've talked about Europe, the European aspects of it. Now we're going to talk about, after the break, we're going to talk about the Germany and the rest of the world, Europe and the rest of the world, and Versailles. Back in a minute.
Hello, this is Sebastian Buzzkill. Please support my daddy by going to ProfessorBuzzkill.com and clicking on the Patreon button. While you're there, subscribe to his email list and shop the Buzzkill bookshelf. Follow him on Facebook, on Twitter at BuzzkillProf, and on Instagram at Professor Buzzkill. Professor Buzzkill is part of Entertainment One's podcast network. It is available on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, and all major podcast apps. Please leave a review while you're there. Thanks for listening.
Okay, and we're back. We talked before we left about how the Versailles Treaty treated Germany and Germany within Europe. We briefly mentioned the loss of overseas colonies, but we want to talk about more of this kind of territorial changes in Europe and then how it affects the worldwide.
Right, because I mentioned the collapse of these empires.
Wide world,
especially in particular Austria-Hungary, which if people should go learn more about Austria-Hungary. It is fascinating.
And fascinatingly complicated.
At least 13 major ethnic national groups represented.
Yeah, but usually by that we mean 13 major languages, which is astounding.
And it's actually more than that.
Yeah.
Including like South Tyrols.
Tyrolean,
and Slovenians and Slovakians and Magyars and Poles, and it's insane. Anyway, so
and if I'm not wrong, the Tyroleans invented lederhosen. So
there you go.
Take that.
There you go. But let's keep in mind, Austria-Hungary collapsed on its own. It wasn't divided up by the Versailles Treaty.
Oh, okay. I always think of it as...
Even before the shooting stopped, individual parts of that empire were declaring themselves independent republics.
Okay.
So it was just a question of drawing the borders. So, I mean, it's much more complicated than this, but things like Czechoslovakia, founded in Pittsburgh, by the way.
Oh, okay.
Poland, I mentioned that. Yugoslavia, these are all new countries. And by the way, and there was this thing called the Inquiry. It was basically Wilson's brain trust. They actually had the best ethnic maps available, and some of the borders they drew were actually pretty good.
Oh, right.
In terms of in terms of self-determination. In other words,
yes, right.
Making borders correspond to geographic location of ethnic national groups.
Okay,
Which
so this
by definition, Austria-Hungary just was not interested in.
Socio-anthropological. Yeah.
Right. And so if you look at the ethnic national map of Europe and some of the borders they drew, some of them are actually pretty good. Nevertheless, you've got a lot of ethnic groups living amongst each other.
Yeah, because it wasn't as if these borders existed before, and it wasn't as if people have to stay where they're born. They don't.
So you have all these multi-ethnic areas and villages and towns, and so there's no way you're going to have complete rationality with these new smaller states. You would have had maybe 200 microstates, which would not have been economically viable, among other things.
And often this leads to resentment. You know, I was in this multi-ethnic thing, but now I'm definitely Czech, or I'm definitely Slovak.
That's right.
And now I feel
right. Or I'm a Ukrainian who lives in this new place called Poland, and the Poles are in charge, and they treat me poorly.
Yeah.
And so, even though my point here is that even though these maps are generally more rational than what came before, that's setting the bar a little low. And a lot of these states, including Czechoslovakia, including Yugoslavia, certainly including Poland, these are still multi-ethnic states with all sorts of tensions and rivalries boiling within them. And, so to have totally rational map would have been impossible without relocations and expulsions on a massive scale. You also have what I believe is some pretty petty score settling. For example, Romania it was Romania before World War I, and then it was Romania later.
Well, there you go.
There you go.
Another example.
So it was an allied country, and so it was rewarded with a chunk of what, by any definition, should have been Hungary.
Right.
So Romania becomes much larger at Hungary's expense because Hungary was part of the defeated AustriaHungarian Empire. And so, in other words, if you're trying to have ethnic national rationality, you would have had a bigger Hungary and a smaller Romania, but here it is. So Romania gets large at Hungary's expense.
Okay. Well, this is sort of, I don't want to say this is outside the important part of the Versailles focus, but it is certainly east of the Versailles focus. Does the Versailles settlement affect things beyond Europe as well? Does it even go further?
Absolutely. And I would spend some time on this, mainly because I think this is often overlooked, that often our history is very Eurocentric, and our look at Versailles is very Eurocentric. But keep in mind, when you break up something like the Ottoman Empire, that's not about Europe primarily. That's about the Middle East.
Yeah.
And the Ottoman Empire in 1914 was a lot smaller than it had been at its peak, which was truly massive. But still, it controlled essentially the entire Arabian Peninsula.
Yeah.
And much of the Middle East, and even into North Africa. And so it is basically, because it was a defeated member of the Central Powers, it was reduced basically to what's called Anatolia and East or Eastern Thrace, which is what Turkey is today.
Yeah, that's right.
So it's basically that big sort of, essentially a peninsula that juts west out of the Middle East into the Mediterranean, and then the little bit of European Turkey where Istanbul is.
Yeah, the sort of the not only the straits, the Bosphorus Straits,
correct.
but also
then
down the western coast.
That's right.
Which is heavily Greek influenced.
Oh, by the way, we're not even talking about that, because at the end of the war, the Greeks have a power grab where they try and seize Western Turkey, and it goes really badly for them, and then all the Greeks are driven out, and there's massacres and everything. Yeah. Oh my God. So the Ottoman Empire is greatly reduced. The rest is divided, and they're not formally colonies. The League of Nations has this provision for so-called League of Nations mandates.
Okay, now this is also another sort of word that covers so many different types of things.
That's right, because there are different types of mandates.
Right.
I mean, this is going to sound cynical, but it's essentially a way of giving spoils to the victors without calling them colonies, and making it look like it's... So it has sort of the official League of Nations approval, as opposed to just a land grab, which is what comes after most wars when you win. You grab turf. So most of the Middle East, or a lot of the Middle East, is divided by the British and the French.
Palestine famously becomes a British mandate.
Palestine and Transjordan and Iraq become British-controlled. Syria, what eventually is Syria and Lebanon, are French-controlled, the so-called Levant. And this also has all sorts of long-term implications. For example, it's not at Versailles, but just a few years later, where modern Iraq is created.
Sure. Yeah.
Purely for the convenience of the British.
Yeah, that's
not
right.
for the convenience of the Kurds and the Shiites and the Sunnis who have to share this space, and to this day don't get along very well. Arab aspirations for independence, despite promises made by. Well, maybe you could tell me. Doesn't Lawrence of Arabia essentially?
Yes, but that's been exaggerated by
he also
Lawrence
makes promises
himself.
that he's not authorized to make.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
right,
Yeah.
right. Well, anyway, and there's a lot of wishful thinking on the Arab side, but they get their hopes up. They help bring down the Ottoman Empire, and they expect a lot more independence than they get. To put it mildly, so there are these ticking time bombs being planted all across the Middle East in places like Palestine.
Right.
Where the British, during the war, famously promised a homeland to the Jews, where they've also promised a homeland to the Arabs.
Yeah.
Although I was just reading about this, more important than that is the fact that after the war, the British allow all sorts of Jewish immigration to the area, which makes the problem much, much worse than it was in 1917 when the Balfour Declaration was made. Anyway, so the entire map of the Middle East is reshaped.
And what about the rest of them? I mean, the people forget about the other parts where the war was going on.
They forget about the Pacific. Let's remember, and I won't talk about Africa, but Germany had a worldwide empire. It wasn't like the British or the French Empire, but it was worldwide. They had 4 colonies in Africa.
Yeah.
They had part of New Guinea. They had huge island possessions in the Pacific. They had a possession in China. So what often gets overlooked is Japan was an allied power in World War I.
Yeah, that's right.
They were on the Allied side. And across the Pacific, they basically took out the Germans. It wasn't very hard.
Yeah.
And so they and the Australians and New Zealanders, they basically divide up Germany's Pacific possessions.
Okay.
So basically, they use the equator, and below the equator, the German possessions go to Australia and New Zealand, and above the equator, they go to Japan.
Wow.
So if you know your World War II history, this has huge implications for World War II.
Oh, absolutely.
Because these island chains in the middle include the Marshalls and the Carolines and the Marianas, which are huge. They cover an enormous stretch of ocean.
Yeah.
We're talking about probably tens of thousands of square miles. And this, to put it bluntly, makes Japan into a Pacific power.
Yeah.
Which it wasn't before. It was an East Asian power.
Yeah, that's
it already,
right.
It already,
right.
you know, it controlled. It had a chunk of China. It controlled Korea. It controlled Formosa, but it didn't really have a power base in the Pacific, and now it does. And so that changes the entire strategic situation leading into World War II.
And so this shows not only that Versailles implications, the implications of Versailles in Europe help lead to World War II, or at least
shapes the emergence of World War II. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, the implications in the Pacific shape the emergence of
World
War II.
And by the way, the African colonies, they're divided between the British and French as well. Although actually German Southwest Africa, today Namibia, that goes to South Africa.
Yeah.
Because South Africa was on the Allied side too. That was their share of the spoils.
Because so much of the 20s and 30s is seen as just is a break away from war, but then it's also seen as just a pause in between this major global conflict that doesn't seem to want to end.
Right, and in some ways, what you're
sort
doing
of in the middle of it.
Right, well, yeah, and what you're doing is sort of a third thing, which is you're constantly putting out fires and coping with some of the unintended consequences of Versailles.
You know, Wilson's such a big deal in Versailles, and we didn't talk about the USA, and we'll have to talk about it in another episode. Well, I'm going to ask you flat out, will you come back and talk more about the USA in Versailles and Wilson in Versailles and all these sort of American things that happen?
I'll have to talk to my agent, but I think we can work it out.
You can barely swing it. Okay.
I might have to get my agent to produce some more headshots.
Okay,
to distribute, but
it's between being here and being on the Colbert Show. Is that what you're saying?
Oh no, I don't do his show anymore. He and I had a falling out.
Okay. All right, Buzzkillers. We'll talk to you next week.